Good afternoon. Welcome to a pride of provosts. As you can see, they're more organized to roar than to have an intimate conversation, but we will try to have an intimate conversation nonetheless. The term of provost is a very ancient one, and it initially referred to people who were superintendents, people who supervised convents and monasteries, people ultimately who were prison wardens. We're getting closer to the modern age and the modern university here. And then it came to be used for the provost marshal, who of course was a kind of police officer, also a very high military officer. And you can see how, in addition to becoming the head of a college, or the head of an ecclesiastical chapter, or the vice regent for a cathedral, or indeed a military policeman, you can see easily how it came to be used for provosts of colleges and universities, who combine all these roles. And the 6 eminent provosts in front of you have combined all these roles, but they've done something else as well, which the title will not tell you. And that is they have represented in an exemplary way a great tradition at the University of Chicago, which is that of the most distinguished members of the faculty giving some of their time to be responsible for the institution and for the administration of the institution. So that deans and provosts have been among our most distinguished faculty and have at the same time served their colleagues and served the institution in remarkable ways. And at the same time, and I don't know how they've done it because being a prison warden is quite enough time for me, how they've done it I don't know, but they've also managed to maintain programs of scientific and scholarly research and often of teaching as well in doing it. And among our distinguished provosts are also, at least in one case, a public servant, namely Ken Dam, who served in Washington in very major roles, as well as in the university. I'm going to add one thing in introducing what I hope will be a conversation among the 6. We have a cheery title, little title, The Changing University. An ambiguous title because it could refer to our university, which we like to think of as the university, or it can refer to universities more generally. And I think it's almost impossible to talk about the one without talking about the other. And I want to say one more word in addition to the excellent words that John Boyer spoke about the leadership of Edward Levi, about another dimension of his leadership that he didn't have full time to explore. And that is Edward Levi's role as the advocate for the idea and the principles of the university. Because Edward confronted, in his time, something unanticipated, something he, I think, would dearly have loved not to have spent his time on. And that was the radical student movement of that day, which, of course, culminated in the sit-in in the administration building, and then led to a very divisive period within the university of disciplinary action and also of divisions among the faculty over some of the issues that characterized that era. Edward Levi wanted to spend his time on his academic agenda and on the building of the university in that sense. But he found himself, in fact, putting out fires and dealing with crises. And he did so in an admirable way and became, I think, the leading president at that time in our country for exemplifying how that could be done in a way that looked to the ultimate purposes of the university, that looked to inciting a conversation, a discussion about what those were, that focused on whether universities should become politicized entities, or whether their independence would be threatened by being of one or another political persuasion, whether it was the right or of the left. And he spoke for those principles, spoke clearly, and spoke in a way that one rarely heard in those days, so that we all knew where he was coming from. We all knew what the essence of this university was essentially meant to sustain. And it brought, I think, at least a unity of discourse that was enormously important at that time. And I mention that now because, in part, in talking about the changing university, one of the questions clearly is, has there been a change from that era? Not only in the size of the university or the complexity of the university or the external pressures on universities, but has there been a change in the conception of how universities should behave, of how universities should think about their purposes, of how universities might be independent? I'm going to ask the question, just to get a conversation going, and I'm going to ask it first of the provost who's had the longest single association with the university, namely Norman Bradburn, who's sitting right in the middle looking out at you. He came here in 1950 as an undergraduate. So he has known the university for a longer time even than I have, or Ken Dam, who I think has the second longest association with the university among us have. My own is 51 years, but Ken's is longer than mine. And I'm going to ask, what is the single thing, if I made you pick just a single thing, that is most significant in the way of change within the university, or universities as you have known them over that length of time? I will say one more thing, and that is we have a cheery title, The Changing University. We have a cheery title for me, which is said to be moderator. I don't know how you'd moderate this, Grang. And I finally decided that the only way to moderation is by the root of terror. And by that I mean that I'm going to ask everyone in any remarks they make, and I hope they'll make a lot, many times, to confine themselves to 3 minutes. And if they don't, I will ruthlessly cut them off. We have Norman to start with, and each provost should be introduced. You know the current provost, Tom Rosenbaum. You know Richard Saller, Geoffrey Stone, who seems to reappear miraculously throughout our day, and as he should, and Norman, and then Ken Dam, and then Ed Laumann. And I had the privilege of working with half of this group. Norman?
Thank you. Yes, I've had the privilege of being at the university through all the presidents since Hutchins. And so I've seen a lot of change, and I'm impressed, I guess, in a way, with the tension between continuity and change. And as one of Edward's, I think, great strengths was to reinforce the kind of continuity issues of various sorts. But since I've been asked to pick this one issue that I've seen as the biggest, I would say change, I would say this is the biggest kind of tension which has evolved over the time I've been here, and that's between the centrifugal and centripetal forces within the university, and particularly as exemplified by the tension between the college and the graduate and professional schools. When I came, the college was still the Hutchins College. It was a kind of mystical, almost revered by the students, although I've learned since from John Boyer that this was not universally admired by many of the faculty at the time. Then the college, I think, declined for various reasons. Other things going on in the university. When Edward became provost, and maybe even more when he became president, he took a great interest in reviving the college, restructuring the college, to bring it back. It had become quite separate from the divisions, and professional schools have been kind of separate anyway, and trying to bring them back together. And as he told, he recruited me to be a master in one of the collegiate divisions, not the first one after they were brought into being, but I think the second one probably. And I remember when he was trying to talk me into doing this, he said two things that I remember. One, that he had eaten his way through the college, which reminded me that one of his ways of bringing the faculty around to some point of view that he wanted was to have a series of breakfasts or lunches or whatever, which were seminars. He did this essentially with everybody who was associated with the college or might be involved with the college, and then came to this new structure that we knew at the time of the college. He made himself dean of the college. I don't know whether John mentioned that this morning, at the time, in order to bring about this change. But the thing which really surprised me and exemplified this tension is he said, I don't care what you do in the college, but don't give up the right of the college to make its own appointments.
Great. Kent?
Well, Hannah, I don't think we should put down size, because I think the growth of the University of Chicago has been very important, and we see it doubling the number of students since I was here originally, and since I was provost, actually. And that has allowed the flourishing of the college, in my view, the additional resources, the amenities for students and so forth, and that's why in part, why the college is so popular today and so well regarded nationally. But the thing I wanted to mention, which is a change in the society, not just in the university, but the impact on the university, I worry about a little bit, and that's modern communications. When I came in the 60s, I went to the Quadrangle Club, the faculty club, whenever possible for lunch. And there I got to meet many, many senior members of university faculties in other parts of the university, not just the law school. I already knew them. But I got to know all of the Nobel Prize winners in economics personally, largely at the faculty club, and some in the sciences too. And that had a big impact on me because it widened my horizons enormously. But today, most people are doing their email. They're not going to the faculty club for lunch. And I'm sure they're closer to the outside world in some sense, at least electronic. But I'm not sure there's the communication of thinking, culture, university ideals across the campus the way it was earlier. At least that's what I feel.
Well, since Ed Laumann is on the left, an unusual position for him, I'll call on him. Ed Laumann.
Well, I was meditating about the change, and I came here in '73, sort of at the very tail end of Levy's time here before he went off to Washington. So he's a bit more of a will-o'-the-wisp to me, and I've been subjected to the cultural stories about him and all the rest of it, and it was great to hear this sort of discussion. But in responding to the notion of change, I was struck more by the kinds of changes that have been imposed on the university from not the financial stress that we've always endured, but the growing litigiousness and the intrusiveness of the federal government on legislating or requiring different kinds of things. And I remember sitting as a provost, because I think many of you may wonder what in the world we do, and it was not clear to me that at the time that I signed on to this, what I was getting into. And it turned out that we met a lot, and we were constantly at meetings, and we were in a meeting with Art Sussman, who was the chief counsel of the university, and we were reviewing a 100-page document that was going to be the rules that describe procedures in responding to terrible emergency events in the university, such as chemical fires and things of that kind. And it was written in the most execrable prose that I've ever seen. And Art and I were both struggling to understand what this was about. And to give you an example, one was the removal of biological hazard in the parking structure. And we couldn't figure out what that was until we finally divined that this person was talking about if someone were to commit suicide from the top of the parking structure, you would have to remove the body, which was a biohazard. And this particular pamphlet was going to be sent to everybody at the university as a protocol about how to respond to all kinds of emergency events, and it was very difficult to figure out what was going on. So there's a sense in which how we are engaged with the urgencies of new regulations, which we just received on financial conflicts of interest, how do we protect faculty time and interests from these kinds of interventions? This was, to my mind, the nature of the changing university, that this was not just the financial crises that we currently have had, but there's been a change in how we think about coping with the larger environment.
I always remember when we were part of building an astronomy instrument on top of a mountain, an observatory. And we thought everything had been taken care of because the problem of the habitat of the red squirrel had been solved. But we were then told we had to wait until the Army Corps of Engineers determined if there were flood damage. This was on top of a mountain. Well, Richard, we've had 3 different approaches.
You forgot me, I was before Richard.
When?
You forgot me, I was before Richard.
You were before Richard, and you think you would therefore have precedence, but you've already talked.
Well, I thought you were going chronologically.
And Richard is not.
You're changing
so
the rule.
I have a reason for calling on
Okay.
you. Thank you very much. You can see what I meant when I said you can't really be a moderator. It's like making peace in the Middle East. Richard, we've had 3 different things mentioned. One has to do with the university more specifically, the relationship between the college and the divisions, and therefore the sort of environment of the university as a whole. One has to do, well, size has been mentioned, but what we've also heard about is the effect of increasing regulatory and external intrusion or oversight of universities, and the sort of different lives, which in part because of social change, university faculty seem to live, which in turn then has an impact on the nature of the university. Do you see the same thing in your university, or the university that you are temporarily engaged in?
Some of the issues are similar, but not all of them. Stanford has never had a college with a separate faculty, and so that issue is not one that we've had to deal with, although the underlying issue there of balancing time for research with time for teaching is certainly there. Federal regulation is oppressive, and it's a big part of the job. I would point to something else to throw into the conversation. I don't know that I would say that it's the most important change. And that is, I think American elite universities have become a kind of recognized model for the world now. And now, for the first time in the last 20 years, most of the countries, the biggest populations of the world, want to imitate. And I think that that's both a huge opportunity for Chicago and Stanford, but I think it's also, it presents risks in the sense that often what they want from us, and I say this particularly from the viewpoint of Stanford, is they don't want the liberal arts education, they want their Silicon Valley. And so there's a kind of risk, I think, of corruption of values that comes with having, being flattered by people coming from around the world saying, we'd like to be like you, but what they really mean is, we'd like certain aspects of your engineering and business, but not the full range of liberal arts studies. And some of the things that the college education that Chicago has stood for over the years. And I hope that can be, that core value can be protected in the face of what I think will be a lot of flattery and blandishments to take us away from our core job.
I notice you seem to be nodding, Jeff. I don't mean sleeping, I mean agreeing. What are you nodding over?
Well, I mean, I agree that American universities have become a model for the rest of the world, and that's brought a huge influx of foreign students, which is a substantial change from the past. But in terms of the initial question about change, I think one thing worth noting is that some of the concerns that were most felt by Edward, I came to the university as a law student in 1968, right when Edward was becoming president of the university, have been addressed in ways that probably Edward would not have imagined, but were in the directions that he would have wanted. So, I mean, one of them has to do with student life, which was clearly regarded as a concern at the time based on what we heard this morning, particularly from John Boyer. And I think we've made enormous strides in that respect. I know when I was provost, we did surveys of alums from the years past, and the almost invariable response from the alums was that I got a great education, I really wasn't happy, and I wouldn't send my kids there. And I think Edward was aware of that, and that was one of the things he was concerned with, and I think we've made enormous progress in that regard. A second change, I think, has to do with Hyde Park, which was a huge challenge for the university. And although Hyde Park still has a way to go, it's no longer remotely the kind of drag on the institution that it was during those years. And that's partly due to factors that are beyond the control of the university, but also very much due as well to interventions that the university has taken over the years. The third factor is the size of the college, which was also understood at that time to be a major concern in terms of the financial robustness of the university, and partly because of the work of Hannah and by presidents and provosts since then. As John pointed out, we've moved to a college of 5,600 today, which is almost 4 times, maybe more than 4 times what it was when Edward was coming in as provost. And that serves all sorts of valuable functions for the university and strengthens the institution as a whole. So I think there have been really important changes that really carry out on what Edward saw as the needs of the university.
Well, Tom, we scarcely have to treat you as some young innocent. You've been on the faculty for a long time, the eternal benefit of the Department of Physics and your university. What do you think about before you fall asleep, assuming you were able to fall asleep?
Well, I'm reassured by being a new kid.
I'm sorry?
I'm reassured by being a new kid on the block, but being able to build on all these contributions. I worry in terms of the tendencies towards intellectual narrowness. I think part of it's what Richard and Jeff were talking about as well in terms of the prevailing pressures in society right now in terms of public education and not valuing it, and thinking about universities as job shops. Not that I think the University of Chicago is directly threatened by that, but I think there is a general tendency that way in terms of higher education. I think internationally the value of business education and science and technology at the expense of a more robust liberal arts education, the notion that we teach our students to think, to solve problems, to be good citizens is not valued in the way it should be, is a real threat. And I think there's another tendency, which is just money, not just, you know, one never has enough money, but it becomes very expensive to compete in all areas. And in fact, you can't compete in all areas. So trying to think intelligently about which areas do you put your resources in so that you're eminent enough across areas to be a great university, but not frivolously spending money in one area where you don't have an attempt to be able to compete on the worldwide stage. And getting that balance right keeps me up quite late.
Let me ask you a provocative question. Why should we be teaching students to be good citizens? I mean, why isn't that the job of families and life and so on and so forth? What do we have as a university to contribute to that?
I think we have a perspective embedded in the development of knowledge that's unique to universities. I mean, universities, as you know better than I, have been around since the Middle Ages. Everybody thinks that means we're still in the Middle Ages, that it's hard to change. I mean, actually, universities can change enormously quickly because 50% of the faculty turns over in 10 years. All your students basically turn over in a period of 10 years. So you're moving huge numbers of people and fresh ideas and blood through it, but you stay true to concepts and ideas that have been developed over centuries. And there aren't other institutions that can do that in the same way. So I think we have a privileged position to be able to educate students as citizens. And in fact, to protect an institution which stands for something different than other institutions.
You think a student is a good citizen who wants to stay alone in his room and play the flute?
I think every student should come to the Logan Center and play the flute and also take the core.
Thank you. What do you think, Norman, about these other areas of change?
Well, like 2 points, I guess. One, when I talked about the centrifugal and centrifugal forces, and use the college and the divisions as an example, it's not just that. It's these other issues about intellectual narrowness. And one of the things that Edward, I thought, really embodied was the kind of notions of liberal education, and through discussion and dealing with ideas as a model for all aspects of education, including the professional schools. And that is a tradition which we had. I don't know, I see some things, my original appointment was in the business school, and I now, which was of that model when I came, but my impression is that it's changed a lot. And I worry a lot about whether professional schools have become more job shops or things like that, and in losing this, what I think is the kind of ethic of the university. And the other point, I think, is that the university can do a kind of thing that no other institution in society does at a higher level than secondary schools and so on. That is really training people how in the basic intellectual skills, how to think critically, how to express yourself, how to write, how to read. I mean, these are kind of fundamental skills which at a higher level is what we keep pushing kind of people towards. And that underlies everything, every specialty of various sorts. Getting the right balance between those, the higher levels of those kind of intellectual skills and specialties is one of the tensions that runs throughout all of the bits of the university, professional schools as well as the higher, PhD programs, as well as the college.
Well, now both Jeff and Kim come from a professional school. They're both university citizens from a professional school. Do you all think that that is changing, as Norman has indicated it might be, that the ties or the integration with the university has weakened at all?
I don't think that the ties to the university have weakened at all. I think throughout the university the same pressures exist. I mean, it's largely, I suspect, the product of tuition. That students are now investing not just 3 or 4 years or more in their education, but they're now going into huge debt. And this is true whether it's the college students or the law students or whatever. And they're worried that this is an investment that needs to get paid off now. And so I think that the fact that tuition has gotten so high has had a real impact upon the mindset of students about what are they getting out of this education. And they themselves are much more concerned about a payoff. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the larger issue. I don't think from the standpoint of the business school, can't speak so much for the business school. I can't say, I would say from the law school standpoint, I don't think that the intellectual quality of the experience or the interconnectedness between the law school and the rest of the university has changed in this regard. But I do think that, like the rest of the university, our students are more concerned about what are they getting for their dollars, because those dollars become much larger than they used to be.
Is that what you see, Ken?
Well, it's hard for me to judge because I've been retired for some time, and while I continue to teach one course, it's just for 1 month, and so I'm not really living at the university in the sense that I used to, although I still see many of my colleagues. So it's very hard for me to judge, but I do worry about what is happening in the society and to what extent that may be playing back. The tendency to have very strong opinions and not listen to other people. We see it in the polarization in our politics and so forth. So if my initial concern about people are not really relating deeply to people across disciplines, but just among the people they're working with or the fields they're in, because they don't see each other as much, because they're dependent more on outside media for not only their information, but their entertainment, so to speak, then we may have a kind of parochialization that's occurring in the university. I don't know whether that's true or not in the minds of the faculty, and that feeds into what the students think, because what the faculty talks about in class, particularly in the social sciences and professional schools, has a lot to do with what the students are thinking about. So it's more a question than an outright worry, because I'm not in a position to judge.
Richard, do you find the same concern about the survival of the liberal arts, that is, the choices made for the liberal arts and the conceptions that university colleges are pursuing that have to do with the liberal arts? Do you find that that is endangered in some way, as people are so concerned about now, in part because of the student and their families' concern that we've heard a little about?
I certainly think so, but I think there's also a dynamic that goes beyond that. I have to say, one of my most bracing early experiences after moving to Stanford a little over 5 years ago was in my first September meeting with new incoming families. I met a mother whose daughter was interested in classics, and so I told the mother to give the daughter my name and invite her to come in to see me about her interest in classics. So 2 weeks later, she walked into my office, an 18-year-old, and the first thing she did was handed me a business card. And I thought, gosh, that never happened to me at the University of Chicago. And I do think that there is, and Stanford is trying to resist that, as Chicago is. I do think both Chicago and Stanford, with their organization, have an opportunity to be leaders in the country, in the sense that I think both institutions, in part because of the role of the provost, can make it easy to cross over intellectually. I mean, I think about the wealth of workshops that we have here that don't observe any departmental boundaries. We have research going on, and I think we shouldn't take that lightly, because I think there are a lot of other universities organized in different ways where the opportunities for intellectual exchange across boundaries is not as easy, but it happens that both Chicago and Stanford do.
And I always think of you as somebody with a wonderful liberal arts education from the college you went to, and as being above all, among all your many strengths, a trainer of graduate students. Are you seeing a change in the background of the graduate students? I mean, do they have the same kind of broad background that you have? Is there any change at all in what you're seeing?
I was going to intervene in a slightly different angle on that.
Do what you want. You always have.
I think that the university here, and Stanford probably is an accomplishment, but the feature that is shared by many of the private schools we've been referring to are that they're relatively small compared to these massive megaliths like Berkeley or wherever. Wisconsin and Michigan, and that we need to think more about optimal size, that too little is not enough resources, and that was in a sense something that Levi was attempting to address, and that too much could be costly. But the social sciences are really lean and mean in the sense that there's not many faculty. There's only 15 faculty in the Department of Sociology. Wisconsin has 45 or 50, and so on and so forth. So we all know each other, the students are exposed to us, and we're all collectively involved in that. And in addition, we fully expect our students to go to work in anthropology or other economics or other collateral disciplines as needed. And so there's a lot of interdisciplinary work. The medical school is now moving much more aggressively in collaborative work with us. I'm currently involved with people who are physicians at the hospital as well as biopsychology and other places on a joint collaborative project. And so I don't feel this vocationalism. And furthermore, most of our students are far more competitive when it comes to writing applications for all these foundations, our students come to the top of whatever they're writing about, because they've been subjected to a kind of discipline, learning how to write critically and presenting their ideas. So I don't share this worry that this is going to go. We have a competitive advantage, and we need to understand what are the conditions that allow us to preserve that competitive advantage. But
What do you think about size, Tom? And what kind of pressures do you experience or feel might emerge as you think about size? How do you think about it?
Well, I think there are particular areas which are vulnerable. So the sciences have traditionally funded in graduate programs through federal support. Federal support, certainly in the biological sciences through NIH, is going to be at best flat, probably will decline. Physical sciences, hard to say, but probably the same prognosis. If that requires central university resources to make up for what's traditionally been the funding model, that will put a particular stress that way. And for experimentalists, which I'm one, your whole research operation is wrapped up with the interchange with students in that fashion on an almost daily basis. Humanities and social sciences, I think the expectations for support by the graduate students have just changed enormously over the years. I think we're seeing that now in the professional schools. So if you want to stay at the same size, putting aside the question of optimization, the expenses required to attract the best talent are just going through the roof. So I think that's a stress. But then you lose a lot. Part of the ethos of the University of Chicago, of course, is the fact that we have a large, robust graduate student population that complements not a huge faculty. And that creates a particular culture that I think is enormously valuable to protect. And so rather than just the exact size, I think it's this balance in being able to have critical mass to be able to support what makes University of Chicago particular.
I have a view, which is, I suppose, a very fashionable view, that is, I'm participating in fashion, that competition at certain levels among universities has become extremely unhealthy, and that we shouldn't pat ourselves too much on the back for coming out very well in the U.S. News and World Report, which is a vulgar way, to put it boldly, assessing the quality of institutions, and yet everyone's very pleased when they come out high, and no wonder that they should. But there is what everyone calls this kind of warfare going on, so that everybody needs better facilities or the same facilities that everybody else has, and so on and so forth. And that an awful lot of the investment of institutions that ought to be going into the strengthening of academic programs and the growth of faculty and the size of class and so on is going into investments that basically are a part of this kind of competition. Am I wrong about this? Do others feel the same way, that there's something unhealthy about a part of the competition, understanding that competition among institutions is good, but instead of allowing us to be selective and saying, well, we're a place that does these things but not that, and those are our strengths, we say, well, we better do what everybody else is doing or else we can't compete. Does anyone else worry about that?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think that U.S. News and World Report in particular has had a profound impact on the way academic institutions think of themselves. And as you say, with good reason, because if you choose to ignore it, you will pay a huge penalty, unfortunately. And so institutions are driven to pay attention to it. And part of what that means is spending a lot of money on things that they wouldn't otherwise spend money on.
Isn't that ridiculous?
Well, yes and no. It's not ridiculous in the sense that if you ignore it, then you will suffer, in fact, really dire consequences. Because students will not come, and faculty... But
that means we're not we're no longer self-directed at all?
Well, right, it's a dilemma. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying I think it's a reality. And to ignore it is not acceptable. But the problem is exactly what you're saying, is it does require us to direct resources in all sorts of ways which are not what the institution would do otherwise if it was completely self-directed. And that's a huge tension that universities face today that didn't exist 40 years ago.
Go ahead, Kim. You were...
Well, I had a question. You know, I come from the law and economics tradition, so the question is, were we talking about supply or demand, buildings versus supportive students and so forth? And I had the impression that universities tend to try to attract funding where they can find it. And if they can find it for buildings, they do that. And I'm not so sure that it's not also what governments and private parties are anxious to provide and what the university wants. It's an interactive process. I don't know whether that's changed over time or not. You might have a better sense of that.
Richard is looking distressed.
Well, I guess I would like to float the idea that Chicago and Stanford are in a privileged position where the quality of the programs really carries the reputation, and we don't have to do so much pandering. I mean, if it were only quality of dorms that counted, Stanford would not be in the rankings much at all. When I was provost, I tried to operate on the principle that I would not be moved by U.S. News categories for rankings unless it made pedagogical sense and made sense for the core values of the institution. And I'd be interested to know whether Tom feels that he spent money on things that were frivolous just for purposes of rankings.
Right, and when I stopped beating my wife. No, I agree largely. I think there are pernicious influences, as you point out. I think we are in a privileged position where we can pick and choose. So for example, spending money on intelligent things like making sure that our class size stays low is a reasonable investment because it's part of what we bring. The core is dependent on that. And so that's not bad. There are other things where, you know, we're just not interested in participating. For us, I mean, to tell you the actual secret with U.S. News and World Report, though we don't believe any of the results anyway, is we actually started paying attention to what they were asking to be reported, which we deigned to do in the past in some ways, largely because it didn't matter in any sense. And now it matters in the sense of the kind of press that you get. But I agree that if you let it drive what you're doing, then you've lost it. I mean, then you're really out of the ball game. I do think there's a more serious thing, though, that you were talking about, Hannah, earlier, which is things like the pressures to build pretty dorms as opposed to hiring more faculty. And where do you cross the line there? And that's a harder one. That's not a rankings issue. That's really a question of, can you make the case to the best students that they should come here anyway, even if the living conditions are not the same as they might find at Stanford or Harvard or Yale or Boston University or wherever it may be. So how far do you have to go there to take that off the table? And that does matter because, of course, we're not just in the business of providing great classes and interesting intellectual experience. Part of it is who you sit in a class with, which is the whole issue of online education and why we're still competitive even as things go online. We're selling something different. We're providing something different, which is a total experience. And a lot of that's influenced by who's in the room with you. And so you do, even if you don't like it, if you're not competitive in that fashion, it's not a good use of resources.
So we've arrived at another question of balance, is it all the issues we've been discussing? Because I certainly take the point, you know, that you can't just forget that there is competition out there and so on. And on the other hand, we've always prided ourselves somewhat on going against the tide. And how do you combine those two things rather than going one way or the other becomes the very large issue.
I'd like to
Norman?
go back to the question of size.
Yes.
And it's somewhat related to the regulation kinds of issues. I mean, there are two things going on that bother me about the way that's having to all universities, but I see it here too. I mean, I grew up, say, in Edward's world, and it was very much anti-bureaucratic. And a lot of what we could do in terms of communication between people was because it was a relatively small community. And you knew people face to face, and all these things that Ken mentioned too, and so they're going on. As one gets bigger, and I don't know at what point this happens, it's just hard, very difficult to maintain that sense of community and knowing people kind of in a way. So that sort of bothers me. The other one is as a consequence of the regulation kinds of things, the university has to keep a lot of records and do a lot of things that didn't have to do and check on things, and all these committees that have to look at animal care and biohazards and protection of human subjects and all these various kinds of things, which are almost inherently bureaucratic in the sense that they have lots of rules and they become very rigid in the way they do things, and introduces a whole thing which is out of the control in the way of the university, although I think we should fight it as much as possible. But that then seeps over into other things about the way people relate within the university, and it's just something which, a kind of change that I see, but it's not something that, I don't like it, and I don't know what you can do about it, because it's really brought about by external forces in a way. But it does change the tenor of the way people relate to one another, kind of in a way. And I think to some extent that's going to happen if you get, even without these other things going on. It's just as you get bigger, that's going to happen, because you just can't you can't know as many people. I mean, if the faculty's 2,000, you're not as composed of 1,000 or something. You're not going to be able to sort of do that. So I think size is something one needs to always be thinking about, not just for its own sake in sort of the economic sense, but these other aspects of relationships between people within the institution.
I should say that Norman presided over what was probably the most important, and certainly the time that I've known the university, study of what the size of the university ought to be and what the balance of its different parts might be at a time when graduate education seemed under siege and jobs were not available for students and our fellowship funds were low. And so you have confronted that question in a number of ways. My own experience is that people always feel that the current size is probably just barely manageable, and therefore think of growth as something that is threatening to a sense of community, to being able to deal in that kind of individual way with students and colleagues and all the rest. And yet over time, that has not necessarily been a problem, but it could become one. Maybe it is something of one. Maybe there are other elements that have gone into it. We have just a few minutes before the audience is going to tear away at us. So let me ask each of you what you think is the big priority to think about to sustain what you find best about universities. What is it that you feel might be perhaps somewhat threatened or perhaps less attended to that you would want to be sure is attended to, Ed? Well, Ken can go first while Ed thinks.
Well, I think the quality of the faculty, but that I don't mean whether they've got a Nobel Prize or, well, that may be important for a lot of reasons, but are they citizens of the university, and are they just sitting in their lab or their study and doing and writing for the outside world and so forth? All their reputation is very important. University is a social organization, and the students particularly benefit from that, but also young scholars, young members of the faculty grow best when they have all of these highly desirable influences from their colleagues and from visitors to the university and so forth, not just in their relationship with their own students, particularly their own graduate students, which may be narrowing, not broadening. It just makes a better university where you have people who view themselves as a citizen of the university, not just as an individual entrepreneur making their name in their narrow specialty.
Ed, can I ask you that question again, or do you want to go on? You want to wait?
Well, I think the issue has to do some way of handling this size thing is that we're talking about 1,000 or 2,000. In fact, nobody exists in this university except in smaller working effective groups. They may be departments or interdisciplinary affairs of that sort. And these things are certainly much smaller operations. And it seems to me that with the development of knowledge and its growing interpenetration, we really need to rethink the departmental structures, which sort of create these silos and these segregate kinds of situations, that we need more creative engagement from the center on trying to help faculties renegotiate some of these interdisciplinary activities and so on, to take advantage of it and to help young people to move into those sorts of things. And this is an extremely vexing and complex problem. How do you evaluate people who are belonging to different units and so on? So there's a lot of sort of tendency for central bureaucrats to prefer well-known decision-making units that have standards and so on. But in fact, I think we need to be a little more creative in breaking out of that presumption and helping the faculty reorganize itself in ways that are deployable in terms of modern 21st century ways of thinking.
Jeff?
I guess maybe the role of funders is a concern. It was a big concern about government funding a dozen years ago. Given the state of the government these days, that may not be as much of a concern at the moment. But I think there is a concern, as there always has been, about to what extent the institutions are making important choices because of where the money is, rather than because it fits the actual academic scholarly goals of the institution. And I think that's a constant stress. And I think the other one is the U.S. News problem, which I think is a huge issue. The U.S. News issue.
Yeah.
That I think is a huge question, is how you strike that balance, which you no longer have the freedom, which you pretty much had before, to make the best institution by your own lights. Partly because you could do what you wanted and it wasn't so visible. Now, those constraints are obviously much greater than they were even a dozen years ago, when this was pretty new. So I think that's a big problem. I think that the dangers of universities being forced into a variety of directions, either because of funders or because of U.S. News type evaluations, poses a real challenge for future administrators.
Richard, where do you come in?
I think my point, what I was going to say, is related to Jeff's first point, and that is just preserving an emphasis on the value of basic research. I think there are all kinds of pressures, funders and others as well, that devalue that as compared with the other things the university does. And I think making sure that that's what universities represent and that it remains sustainable is important.
Norman?
I would second what Ken said about the importance of being faculty being institutional citizens and so forth. A gloss I'd put on that is the tradition here very strong of faculty governance. I mean, the fact that all of us came out of the faculty, and all of us except Richard temporarily have gone back to the faculty. The use of committees, which is a way of knitting people together, getting people to be involved in the running of the university, and so there's not a gulf between the administration and the faculty the way there is in so many universities.
Well, I think this is a very integrated
and that's a
view
very
that comes out of the answers all of you have given, and that gives you a sort of mandate, Tom, I think. But I'll let you have the last word.
No, it's a privilege. I think creating a sense of possibility, and to that end means constant reinvention while staying true to the basic ideals of the university. I mean, we have enormous cultural capital, and that's how we actually compete, I think, with institutions that have a lot more money in the bank, if you will. And making sure that we communicate to the faculty about an environment that lets you do things here that you can't do elsewhere, which touches a bit on the citizenship. I think it talks about resisting these pressures. And it's an example, I think, of being interdisciplinary in the best sense, as you're talking about, but maintaining, making sure you're not facile and that there's disciplinary strength in that fashion. I think Chicago over the years has done that in a particular way, but it takes constant attention to make sure that you can continue to do it effectively.
I think you can all see how fortunate the university has been in its provosts, beginning with Edward Levy and coming on with the 6 provosts whom we've heard from. And we now have the opportunity to have questions from the audience or comments from the audience. You too are subject to the same terror that I announced at the outset. Does anyone have comments, questions that they'd like to raise? I didn't mean to introduce total terror, only partial terror.
Hello?
No questions?
Yeah, no.
Right here.
Where?
Yeah, go ahead.
Please. Can you shout? Can you shout? So that you can be heard? Perhaps getting up will help. Yes.
Here, microphone.
There we go.
Thank you. I was wondering what your concerns are about the electronic issues, because here you have somebody like Bill Gates who made millions and becomes a role model in some ways for your students because money is something. And for the first time, I'm a Harvard graduate, in 350 years, Bill Gates, a dropout, was the commencement speaker. And the point of my question is, these people become role models, whether you like them or not. That whole industry is burgeoning. And I think, do you bring them in and say, okay, this is something you might want to do. We want to show you that even without the education we provide, they have become successful and maybe, I don't know. But how do you handle something that becomes a really pervasive? When I'm on my way here, my 3 minutes is up, I know, almost. People are around the block to get the new iPhone. It's very much part of our culture now. And I think one of you talked, I think it was you, about how the electronic issues stop people from interacting personally with one another.
Let's hear from Silicon Valley.
Yeah, well,
First time
so
in
first of all, let me say,
dropout.
all of the hype in the press about what Stanford is doing in the way of online education is hype. It's grossly overstated, and the thought that the University of Virginia president may have been briefly sacked because she wasn't doing what Stanford is doing is a terrible joke. But I think, you know, Stanford above all, and I think Chicago has this problem less. Stanford does have a problem of attracting more than its share of students who want to be the next Hewlett or Packard or Gates. And so I view my role there now as trying to insist that these students also get a kind of deeper education in the way that the Chicago core has provided over the years, so that it's based on some values. The drumbeat out at Stanford is innovation. I mean, everybody has to be talking about innovation. And I was tickled for the first time to see a comment by one of our recent alums pointing out that not all innovation is good. Nazism was an innovation when, you know, and so we need to provide the broader education. You know, Peter Thiel out there is now paying students not to go to college. I don't think that's going to get very much traction. You know, you look at the odds, and you might be the one in tens of millions who's the next Gates or Thiel, but students still want an education. We need to make sure that it's a broad enough education that includes the values, the citizenship that Tom talked about, and isn't just kind of mindless. Let me just say the one possibility, this sort of apocalyptic vision right now that's being talked about out there, and maybe here too, is that with online education becoming available, and Stanford and MIT and Harvard and others licensing courses, one scenario, and we've seen a glimmer of this as Colorado State has begun to accept a Udacity course for credit at Colorado State. One model of what might happen is that the universities like Chicago and Stanford license courses that then get offered for credit at other institutions that take responsibility for assessment and so on. And essentially, at some level, turns those institutions into a set of teaching assistants, basically. If that happens, that will have, that'll have profound consequences in a lot of ways, not least of which will be how we think about the purpose of our doctoral education, creating the next group of scientists and scholars.
Other questions?
Yeah, hi.
Yes, sir.
I had a question about leadership. Somebody mentioned that we at the university are fortunate to have provosts and other leaders who came from the faculty, went back to the faculty, sort of sophisticated, distinguished intellectual leaders who happen to also have the capacity to run a university. If you think about two things that you've mentioned, one was costs, rapidly rising costs of university. The second one, I think somebody called it bureaucratic regulations, basically. The fact that universities are much more complex. As administrative units, they have to do a lot more and more complicated things that they had to do even a generation ago. It's actually not that hard to imagine that over the years, we'll need, well, experts. So the kinds of leaders who are very good at securing resources, at managing bureaucracies, et cetera, who are not necessarily also the kinds of leaders who are sophisticated and distinguished intellectuals. And so my question to all of you is, do you see a potential issue here in securing the kind of leaders that are going to be required over the years in a place like the University of Chicago, which traditionally has wanted intellectuals to run the place, but increasingly also needs people with, well, MBAs or the kinds of backgrounds that are not typical of historians or sociologists, or take your pick.
Who'd like to tackle that?
I would say that. I think it's the really important point about academic leadership is understanding what the basic values are and what the basic goals and missions of the university is. You can learn all this other stuff. It's not all that complicated. I think, I mean, you're right, the supply is relatively small because we select in promoting people to tenure and so forth, essentially for traits that are not necessarily related to that. But there are people who enough that you can do this. So I don't worry too much about that. I think administration in that sense, leadership in that sense, is something which is much more a question of the basic kind of values and understanding of what is really important in the institution and so forth.
Anyone else? Ed?
I think that one of the fundamental features of universities of our sort is that they're collegial. And basically, you were asking the question, can we afford a dilettante leadership? That is, somebody recruited from our members, promoted for a while to run the show, and then go back, and to accept that. I think that model, I don't have any particular reason to believe that that isn't going to work fine. You can always hire fancy lawyers to read the fine print from the missives from the NIH or whatever to give some ammunition, but you have to have some people who have the instincts about how is this going to impact us as a collegium. And I think that the fundamental issue about the university is that you want leaders who come from us and who are us in some ways, and that to imagine a specialized academic leadership that are technically knowledgeable about how to deal with other bureaucracies is not the notion of countervailing forces that I think we need to do.
Well, where do leaders come from in academia? We talked about Edward Levy and discussion, talking things through, with other people, not with just with yourself or just your people with the same training and background that you have. And I think the faculty committees, which I think you mentioned, were extremely important in that regard. And working across departments on various, I know the social sciences are particularly good at that, and I believe in parts of the physical sciences. Increasingly, that's true, even across between physical sciences, biological sciences, increasingly. That builds leadership qualities. You don't build leadership qualities just working in your own narrow department or in your own specialty. And I think the way the Chicago faculty, in my experience, has operated is ideal from that standpoint. I'm not sure that every university is. In fact, I'm quite sure many universities are not. So
People used to ask me what I was doing as a Renaissance historian in this business. I could always point out that my major work was on Machiavelli. But in fact, I think the most important thing that you have to do is appoint very good people. You're not going to be a specialist in everything. What you need is the overview of the whole and a very good taste in people and a sense for the kind of structure in which those people are going to be working, and as well as the sense of collegiality and the attention to the different forms of administration, because they are different within a university. I mean, the way in which you work with faculty is different from the way in which you work with the vice president for finance and that person's staff, and they are used to different ways. It's more like being a mayor than it is a CEO in some ways too, because there is that very powerful political aspect to it. And if you don't have that, you can have all the financial expertise in the world that you want, and you're still not going to make it, would be my answer, but I'm not meant to answer. I'm not one of these provosts. I was provost somewhere else. Jeffrey?
Yeah, one of the things we haven't talked a lot about here is the intellectual values, the culture of the University of Chicago. And a couple of points about that. I mean, first of all, those of us who are at the university and have been at the university understand that it has a very distinctive set of values and culture, even among the world of higher education. We talk about ourselves in ways that are different and which are recognizable to people from Stanford or Harvard or Yale as a Chicago way of thinking about the institution. Much of this derives from Edward's way of talking about the institution. Has been reinforced and refined in the years since. There are lots of elements to it. One line I particularly like from a faculty report about 20 years ago was that at the University of Chicago, the only appropriate response to even the most withering question is not resentment, but gratitude. And there are lots of other things like that, but they do capture something essential about the intellectual inquiry and culture of the place. And as Edward said to me when I asked him, and some of those of you here this morning heard this, when I asked him what makes a great academic leader, he said the academic leader must radiate the values of the institution. And I don't think a university with an accountant or a lawyer who's a lawyer or a businessman at its head would flourish for very long. It may run well, but it will lose the core intellectual definition that makes it what it is. So
Tom,
you can hire people, but you can't.
Tom gets the last word again. Thanks. Tom?
I was just going to say that Don Randall famously said that here I run a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and there's not one person I can give a direct order to. And which speaks to being mayor in a way. If you don't understand the culture and you don't know how to navigate the peculiarities of faculty consultation and governance and the decentralization versus the centralization, you're not going to succeed, I don't think, in a university environment. So I don't worry about continuing to draw leadership from the ranks of the faculty. However, Mary, I do think one of the points that is relevant, that's implicit in your question is, I think there are more demands for an infrastructure because it is a complicated corporation. And acceptance of the need for that infrastructure becomes harder, particularly in times when you're cutting back in terms of resources. So I think there is an additional tension that way, which will be expressed in terms of how corporate, in terms of capability, do you get centrally, but not in terms of valuing the type of leadership that's in tune with the primary values of the faculty.
Let me ask further questions. Yes?
Yeah, two quick questions. First, in the 70s, John Wilson famously said that other universities have more money, but Chicago has more university. It seems 4 decades on that you all are pretty much saying the same thing, although we have a little more money now than we had in the 1970s, but still. And then I'm curious, Mrs. Gray, obviously you served more than twice as long as any of the other presidents in the Provost half-century. With all the other presidents, so basically 1-to-1 president and provost, and there were 6 in your administration. In retrospect, was that because there were different strengths, different issues to tackle, the length of the time, or just circumstances?
I kept losing provosts, which people thought was very careless of me. I lost Ken, who became Deputy Secretary of State. I lost Bob Adams, who became Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. I then lost Norman to be the head of the National Opinion Research Organization or Corporation. I lost Gerhard Casper to be president of Stanford University. I was very careless. But I think that it says something about the good fortune of being able to have as colleagues for at least some period of time people of that kind of quality and people who had that range and those different perspectives to bring on questions that kept recurring. Because one of the things that happens if you serve for a long time is that problems recur, and you want to be sure that you're not just repeating either the way in which you think about them or the way in which you address them. And in that sense, I think that having some rotation of provosts, although each time I became somewhat surly about it, that nonetheless it was not an unhealthy thing. And it was not, I think, because we had internal differences. In fact, we really didn't. We had good, strong, independent minds who often argued in the collegial way that we do here. And that was what made it fun, truth to tell, was that process within the administration. That's the best part. Yes.
Thank you for this great panel. I've been at the university long enough to have known each of you in your offices, I think. And it's one of you, I think, who first told me about Harper's tripartite vision of the university, in which the first part comprises pretty much everything that we've been talking about here today, the college, the divisions, the graduate schools. The second part is the press, and the third part is the enterprise of continuing education. So the other two parts that we haven't talked so much about are publication and the public. And because of the sorts of issues raised by the lady who asked the first question here today, it seems to me that those are two aspects of the university that have changed a lot in the last 60 years and stand to change quite considerably in the next 10 or 20. Could one or more of you address the question of how you think the fate of the book will matter to the way the university does its business? And the further question, which I think might be more important and closer to the First Lady's issues, of how the public's understanding of its own capacity to create knowledge in the new digital environment might be seen as a rival to our claim to validate and vet legitimate knowledge. So how information relates to knowledge and how we're going to deal with that as the university and as universities over these next, let's say, next 10 or 20 years.
My friends.
Stanford has already given up on books.
Okay, Richard. There you go.
I think elite research universities occupy a different space than higher education in general. I think our role in that way will obviously change in method of delivery, but not in general approach. I mean, we will still be bastions of creation of knowledge and the integration of that creation and dissemination, even though modes of dissemination change, linked to education. I think there's a far greater chance that public institutions and moving down in terms of that mission or broader mission will be incredibly effective. And frankly, we've not done a good job as an industry in explaining our worth to society. I mean, every time I hear some congressman say something like, well, we shouldn't support NOAA, Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, because you can get the news, the weather on your evening news, which is a true story. I think as a scientist, gosh, I hope that person wasn't in a class I taught. I mean, we have not conveyed the worth and the connection of discovery and ability into education. So I think that's a challenge that is only accentuated by the kind of trends that you're talking about.
But do you want to add to that, Richard?
No, well, I do think that the issue of vetting and authorization of knowledge is a huge issue, and I have no idea how that's going to come out. I think that's, you know, when I started as provost, I wouldn't have guessed that the press and the library would be the two parts of the university where we had to cope with the fastest change, but that was the case.
Questions? I'm sorry, it's hard to see people because of the light. Yes, sir.
I want to go back to the U.S. News and World Report problem as part of a larger problem. And I'm wondering, which means is that I take it the community at large does not really understand what universities can be like, and therefore they rely upon what kind of surveys they provide. What would happen if the 24 best universities in the country conspired to say, we don't cooperate in any way with the U.S. News and World kind of approach and begin to try to educate people to that effect?
You probably see someone walking on water again. Friends?
Oh, go ahead. Well, just at a practical level, a lot of the data they get are public. So even if you refused to supply the part that comes from the university, that wouldn't stop them because a very large portion of what they do, they're gathering from public sources. So you would just shoot yourself in the foot in a way by suppressing some parts of it. I mean, all of these strategies have been tried at various times, but in the end, the demand for that kind of information, whatever its values, just it gets them to continue, and there's really nothing I think can be done on that score.
Well, unfortunately, it's this that's keeping the U.S. News and World Report alive. They'd be bankrupt otherwise. I mean, that's really what's kept them going, I think.
Yeah.
And we have to hope that they will somehow get hidden online.
Would also violate the antitrust laws, by the way.
Questions?
It would violate the antitrust laws.
Questions?
Yes,
Yes,
I have a question.
Could you talk a little louder?
Yes. You've talked about the size of the faculty increasing. We've seen enormous, and the students, enormous changes in the campus that affect where we eat. We don't all go to the quad club anymore. There are cafes and cafeterias around campus. And this has had an impact in terms of where we gather and what it means for our community. And I'm curious about what you see in terms of the development of the pipeline of the next leaders at the university. What impact the size, the growth, the physicality of the campus is making in terms of the congeniality and the sharing of ideas amongst our young faculty.
Richard?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because this was something I was thinking about with one of the earlier questions. I mean, and actually this goes back to, I think, a point that Ed made earlier. You know, one of the reasons that you can get provosts who can do the job in spite of the fact that we've not had any formal training is that there is a severe selection process, right? There are 1,200 faculty and there's one provost, and so there's a high degree of selectivity. And I think it's the people in the departments and who interact in workshops who know the faculty best and who can evaluate those qualities of radiating the values and trust. I mean, we haven't talked enough about trust, I think. It's really critical that the faculty trust the provost, the president, to make good decisions. And that's, I think, something that's tested out in much smaller units in much more intimate settings.
And
One more question?
There is a whole series of, you might say, practice kinds of things in terms of these faculty committees that I talked about, the Council of the University Senate, the Committee of the Council. I mean, there are just lots of places that people get to know one another in different units. They come to understand different aspects of the issues facing the university and so forth. So there is a lot of opportunities for people to kind of see what's like.
Ken?
And the vitality of the Hyde Park Kenwood community is also very important in that regard.
Yes.
And I think that the saving of it, and Edward had a lot to do with that, has been very important to the university. Not just from a safety point of view, but just from a community point of view, because so many of the faculty still live in the community, though perhaps fewer than before as a percentage.
We promised you that you'd be out of here at 3:30, and so I'm going to let this class go. Thank you for your questions, and thanks above all to the provosts who, as you can tell, have been such wonderful leaders at the university in the tradition of Edward Levi. Thank you all.